that's a really appropriate quote for the theme we're taking up today, which is exercising the mind. Our speaker today is Daniel Alcantar. I don't know very much about Daniel. I know a little bit that he took some science classes and astronomy classes from a dear friend of mine, Kim Miller. Joe Miller, Kim's husband, has given, I think, a talk or two for GEMS. And Daniel, I think as a young student, got very inspired by science and especially by astronomy and the willingness to ask really big, deep questions about life and the universe and so forth. And through all that scientific effort, expanding the mind and exercising the mind. We're all challenged these days with this new telescope that's come online out in space called the James Webb Telescope that's even going to take us deeper into the unknown territories of the universe and maybe help us explore and understand more about this amazing cosmos that we all live in. But this is what Daniel has been, he has a thirst for it, he has a love for it, and a longing to ask these deep questions. And so with no more further introduction, Daniel, I turn it over to you to exercise our minds for a little while.
Thank you very much, Cliff. Well, I'm glad you mentioned the James Webb Telescope because I want to start off by highlighting this picture, one of the first images that was publicly released. Now, for those of you who don't know me, I'm an astronomy student studying at New Mexico State University, and I actually just finished my first year as a PhD student. So in this coming August, I'll be resuming my studies of high redshift galaxies. So I study galaxies as well as planets in the context of planetary formation, and also study gravitational lensing, which is actually what you're seeing in this image. We're seeing, of course, an ensemble of galaxies, but what we don't see in this image is the presence of a galaxy cluster, a massive ensemble of galaxies. And just the giant mass of hundreds of galaxies curves the fabric of space-time. And what happens is background galaxies, the light, when it reaches the galaxy cluster, it curves around the fabric in a straight line, and then we get these characteristic arcs. So in this image, it might not be so obvious, but there are these archy looking galaxies, and these are actually background sources. This is not what they actually look like. The reason they look as arc objects is because the light is being bent around, it's being lensed by a giant mass. But we don't see the mass, but we infer its presence just based on the observations. Now, I'm still pursuing the study of gravitational lensing, but the images that I look at are not as pretty as this, even though they are inherently the same phenomena. Let me show you probably the best picture that I have in my studies. This is also a gravitational lensing event. These are two particular bands. There's the green filter on the left and the infrared on the right. And in the green, you see that there is this archy looking thing on the top. And in the infrared, you see that there is an arc on the bottom. So when you compile these together, you get a more coherent picture, but this is still far-fetched from what the James Webb is providing. Again, these are the same thing. These are the same inherent phenomena. These are gravitational lenses, but compare this to, say, my second best candidate. So this one in the green filter on the left, you can't really see any arcs. There is a little blobby thing on the bottom left that I happen to know after many months of study that this is actually informative, and the color difference here actually allows us to distinguish this from like an ordinary astrophysical source. But in the infrared, you see that's actually where we see the arcs. So again, compared to the James Webb image that we saw earlier, there were so many arcs, but since the quality of this of this data is not of the same caliber, I'm very lucky that I can even see two little arcs. But again, compared to this, how many arcs do we see here? If I begin to count, I think I'll probably get lost after 30 or 40. But again, these are, if I had a telescope, a space telescope, and I could point at these same objects that I just showed you, I would see something like this. Just because I don't see it doesn't mean that it's not there. Now, the data that I deal with, which again resembles this same phenomena, it actually looks like this. Now, you take a look at this visually, you probably wouldn't say that this is an lensing event. There are no visible arcs like we saw in the James Webb telescope. But indeed, if I had a telescope, a space telescope, and I were to look at this particular object, I would see more or less the same level of detail, the same characteristics. So why is it that when I look at different objects, I see different things, even though the principle is the same inherent phenomena? Well, it has to do, of course, with the properties of the objects, as well as the distance, the color, stuff like this. Now, the reason I wanted to point this out in the context of exercising the mind is that as as a PhD student, when I came into the program, I would admit that I very much had a very linear way of thinking. You know, when I saw a problem, my very first instinct was to immediately try to jump to a conclusion, try to jump to some sort of approach that is very linear in nature. Now my professors, that's something that they've been trying to teach me, and especially in astronomy, there's a lot of stuff that we don't see, and that's what I wanted to highlight with these images. So yes, these images that I'm showing you, this is the same thing as this, but we can't really see it. Now my algorithms, they notice very subtle color differences, so that's why I'm able to use this data here to actually do research. But in principle, you just visually speaking, these are very different images. You know, of course they are, but they are inherently the same. And that's something that I've been struggling with, because in astronomy, again, there is a lot that is hidden from us. And there's a joke in astronomy that if you cannot explain something, then it has to do with dust. If there's something in your calculation that's wrong or in the theory that's missing, probably it's because there's a lot of dust in space between you and the object that you're looking at. And it's very easy for us to just say, ah, yes, it's not a problem with my calculations per se, but there's something invisible here between me in the line of sight. And because of this invisible stuff, you know, my research is a little bit inconclusive. So that's something that I've learned this year. When I study planetary formation, this project that I'm doing with my advisor, actually, we're looking at when you take a look at stars that are forming planets, very, very early stars, and then you take a look at stars like our sun that have already formed planets, the mass in those two systems do not coincide. In other words, the mass that we see in young stars that are forming planets is way less than the mass that we see once the planets have been formed. This is called the missing mass problem. It's a big dilemma, because in principle, the mass should be there. And sure enough, the theories are that the mass is there, but we simply cannot see it. So my research has been trying to quantify just how much mass is being hidden. And again, if it weren't for my advisor pointing me toward this direction, I probably would have assumed, or I probably would have tried to jump or try to arrive at a conclusion that circumnavigates any inconveniences, if that makes sense. It's an inconvenience in astronomy to think of dust in space. It's an inconvenience in astronomy because we can't it's hard for us to deal with this, but we cannot get away from it. Now, as students, naively, I do, when I do my research and I get results that I'm not very happy with, I try to justify it in some way that does make sense. But trying to do that this year, I ran into a lot of walls and a lot of problems, because not only do I lack the expertise to properly, you know, take the correct path immediately, but actually what's been happening with me is that I take a look at images like this and I fail to see the actual picture. And in fact, I've been so focused on trying to derive computational methods for these systems that in a way, I forgot what my purpose as an astronomer was. As Cliff was alluding to, I'm here to, of course, ask these questions, but approach them in an appropriate manner. And this approach is something that I've been struggling with as a first-year student, and I know a lot of students struggle with this, but I've been made aware of this because of not only the connections that I've had with great professors that are taking care of me, but also because I've been trying to remind myself over and over again that there's a lot that I don't see, not only visually, say in data, but there is a lot that I don't know about the science. There's a lot that I don't know about the institutions. I don't know about the way of thinking. I'm coming so new into this, and my way of thinking in the past, again, this linear way of thinking, is no longer going to work for me. So again, back in the context of exercising the mind, I think a lot of times we think, how would I exercise the mind? Meditation, or maybe study? I like this quote here by Santiago Ramon y Cajal, who states that time and concentration allows the intellect to perceive a ray of light in the darkness of the most complex problem. And sure enough, when I think of exercising the mind, I think of books, I think of studies, I think of reading literature, doing research. And sure enough, that is very important, as a good friend Santiago Ramon y Cajal is telling us here. Time and concentration, patience is a virtue, as I just heard. This is all, I think, something that we're familiar with. When we do these efforts, we have a new job, for example, we pursue a new endeavor, we're very much aware that It's going to take time. It's going to require patience. And it's something that I was also aware of when I did my undergraduate studies. I studied physics. It was very, very difficult. I sat on my desk for many, many hours doing absolutely nothing. So I know what it takes to, sit down and try to concentrate, put some time for some sort of research project. But I think now, after this first year as a PhD student, I think of exercising the mind a little bit differently. And the picture that I think of is something more, it's more of a walk, I think, because in the reading that I had forwarded earlier by the great emperor Marcus Aurelius, he writes that the way that we tackle problems, the way that we push our mental intellect towards something should be like a ray of light. Was the first excerpt that I had chosen. It's because in his example, he says when a ray of light, just like your thinking, hits a wall, it's an impediment. Like in astronomy, we hit dust. Well, he's warning us not to move. I would, when I hit this dust, I want to move away. I want to go down. I want to go up. I want to avoid the dust. I don't want to deal with it because it's such a hassle. It's such a headache. And I don't feel like I'm prepared. I feel like if I try, I'm going to get stuck in a belt bundle. And then 10 years later, I'm not going to be any closer to a result. But this is, again, the linear type of thinking that I think is very prohibitive in academia, especially when we're dealing with cosmological skills. So I've been thinking of how do I exercise my mind now that I've been made more aware of these issues. And I think about the other quote from Marcus Aurelius that states that our way of thinking, it should be like a light, because it hits a wall, it hits something, but it stays on it. Yes, it may diffuse outward, but it's still the main beam is still tackling the problem despite the obstacles that it's facing. How do I exercise my mind? If I were to give this talk last year, I think I would have very, very well taken a linear approach, something like this. You want to exercise your mind, sit down on the desk or go out to the park and dedicate a couple hours a week at least to actually doing mental activities. Challenge yourself mentally by tackling problems just for fun. But that's no longer what I think about when I think about how to actually not only improve my intellect, but how do I more generally learn to approach problems? And again, this is why I brought up this image of going through a walk in the woods. I think that's what our mind should be like. And by this, I mean, when we run into these obstacles, when we run into these issues, like again, I keep bringing this example of me running into this dust, it's a big problem around this space. Well, what you should do is you should take a walk, actually maybe tangential to the problem in a way that is not obvious, but just try to explore different avenues, maybe completely unrelated. And one example that I can give, which I think is fascinating, is that a couple years ago, some scientists found that it is actually possible to find galaxies if you search for galaxies using a machine learning engine trained to find cats and dogs. So you think to yourself, what's the similarity between cats, dogs, trains and cars, and galaxies? And I think of none. I think to myself, if you have a machine learning classifier that can find cats, dogs, cars, and trains, stuff like this, there's no way that it's ever going to be able to find galaxies. But sure enough, a couple of years ago, someone found out that if you use this classifier as a preset model, you get very, very high accuracy for galaxy classification. And I think the answer is, even though I can't prove it, is because the highlighted areas of animals and objects are very similar to the highlighted areas of different galaxies. I don't know what these relations are. I would, if I ever learn what these particular patterns are, I will for sure share them. But I think, is there a relationship between everyday objects here and galaxies? And I think if I were to refer back to my linear way of thinking, I would say no, of course not. Cats and dogs have noses and they have eyes. Galaxies don't have eyes. So there is no obvious connection. But if I go back to these first images that I see here, if I were to take a look at this image without knowing what it actually was ahead of time, I would probably say this is a star. Or maybe I would say, oh, it kind of looks like the moon. But really, it's something like this. And that's why I wanted to start off by highlighting the fact that there is a lot that we don't see, of course, in the context of astronomy, but also in our daily lives. I think about When I outside of academia, when I'm pursuing my own intellectual challenges, how do I actually go about exploring these avenues? It's very difficult. I have to admit, because as a very early on student, I'm still clinging on to my old ways. I'm very uncomfortable accepting the fact that I don't know. And even though, of course, we don't know, we have to tackle these problems, we have to ask these questions. It is still very uncomfortable for me to, when I face an obstacle, it's my instinct to kind of turn around and then just go the other way. But what Marcus Aurelius was telling us was to know that the mind is not like a dart. The mind can take many, many different avenues before it makes a straight dart toward the right way to formulate the problem, which is why I really like this quote from Santiago Ramon and Cajal. And I have this image here on the left of a ray of light. Eventually, I like to think that eventually if you concentrate enough on a problem in a non-linear fashion, in a way that allows you to explore different avenues, you will eventually slip through the cracks. And that's the image that I saw here. But again, in a more practical sense, as I just finished this first year, I think about ways that I can change my mindsets. And I think the best way to do it for me is to find ways to intentionally challenge myself in uncomfortable manners. And one example that I can think of is the way that I interact with my peers, and not only in academia, but family and my friends as well. A lot of times I forget that there is a lot that I don't know, or there's a lot that I don't see. Similar to these images here, I take a look at, I may see, say, somebody, a person that maybe just, maybe the way that they act, or the way that they present themselves, perhaps from previous experiences, from the way that my mind has been trained up to these 26 years of my life. Perhaps this individual, these people, when I'm engaged with them, I may jump into conclusions, and I may think, oh, you know what, this person is very different from me. We grew up very differently. There's not very much in common. I can't really understand them, and I think that's the wrong approach for me. So I've been trying to tie the way that I approach my daily life with the way that I approach my academic research, and that's been a very, very difficult process. But I think for me, currently at this stage, I'm always reminded of what I cannot see. And when I think about individuals, for example, there's no way that I'm ever going to know everything about them. But while it is uncomfortable at times, as long as I remember that there's stuff that I don't see and I can't understand, but it doesn't mean that I can't. Again, the way that we exercise our intellect is, as Marcus Aurelius was alluding, it should be like a ray of light from the sun. The sun right now is shining through this glass, and it's not going through, but the light is still hitting this glass. It's not giving up, I guess. And even though it's hard for me to go about and try to change the way that I approach social situations and stuff like this, I'm reminded always, every time I have negative thoughts, for example, not only in my research, oh, this is not going well, or with my relationships, oh, this relationship isn't going well, I always remind myself about, oh, I remember this project that I was doing. I was trying to study planets. And one thing that wasn't obvious to me was the presence of an obstacle. And I didn't want to acknowledge it, because again, it makes me uncomfortable, because I don't know how to deal with this. And I think in my daily life, that happens from time to time when I'm engaged with somebody that I don't know how to deal with it, and I want to just walk away, turn sideways, turn back. But I try to remind myself that there is so much that I cannot see, and likewise, there's so much that they can't see about me, that it's not fair, or it's not right to jump into any type of conclusion without properly exercising your mind towards this problem. And I have this image here. So the final quote from the 8th book from Marcus Aurelius, it highlights the interdependence not only that we have with our fellow beings, but also how I think what he was trying to say is that the best way to exercise our mind is to be open to the fact that we don't know. And I wish you all a very fruitful discussion.
Thank you very much, Daniel, very much for your thoughts on this. It's a good launching point for taking on the subject of exercising the mind, especially beginning with the idea that we don't really know, and that we need to open up our minds, be more aware of who we are, who we're dealing with, the environment around us. I mean, the Still and Moving Center, as its focus, is being able to use the body in a mindful way. But I think that this whole conversation circle is about also how can we properly exercise the mind in and of itself. And so the thoughts that you have given on the scientific approach, and not seeing things in a linear way, but more in an imaginative way, and more in a broader, more expansive way, has been very helpful for starting this conversation. That's the idea of exercising the mind from the scientific point of view. But I think we wouldn't be in this group together if we weren't trying to exercise our minds in one way or another. So I thought maybe each of us could share some thought on how do you see the idea of exercising the mind? I think it's not a subject that we think about very much. You know, exercising the bodies, we spend a lot of time maybe thinking about how to stay healthy in our bodies, but how can we exercise our minds to be healthy in a mindful way? Does anyone have any thoughts on other approaches to exercising the mind?
Well, old-fashioned way is to read, encounter words that are put together to stimulate thought. And one could say a lot about that, but it's all research. Reading really does stimulate the brain and the mind. And the second avenue is to listen. Listen to, I've just been watching NOVA programs on astronomy, and I learned all about Jupiter last week. And I didn't know anything about this, but you listen, and there's all kinds of things. You can listen to your neighbor, you can listen to a prepared talk, you can find it, but we don't, and concentrate, decide, okay, I'm going to listen to this. It's probably an hour long. I might not understand it. And that's the third thing, is don't expect, if you think you quickly understand everything that someone says or that a book says, well, then you're kind of going through it too fast. And second readings and all of that. So I would say reading and listening are ways that are always accessible to us and don't have to cost any money. So those are some suggestions.
Well, those are super practical. Very good suggestion. Anyone else have any thoughts on how to exercise the mind? Diana?
You know what came to my mind as he was speaking was, in Zen, we talk about only don't know and beginner's heart mind. And I find that for me, it's easy to get stuck in the way we see and think and view things. But if we're always a beginner, then we're going to be curious and read and learn and be open to keeping the mind open to find something new. If we do think we know, if we know everything, we're going to be stuck in what we think. And I think that the reading and talking and listening are really important. But if we come at them from only don't know, and I used to hate that because it's very uncomfortable to only don't know. And but what I'm finding is the more that I open my heart and my mind to listen and to be present in new things, I'm being guided and learning new things all the time. And I think that helps a flexible mind. That's how we exercise our mind. Now, I do play games, I read, I take classes, I do writing, I do all those things, but I think it's also staying engaged in the world. We can get caught. Many times we get caught even in reading or playing games or watching TV. And it's like we get caught in this loop. So how do we find new things and things that stimulate our heart and our mind. But we come with a beginner's heart mind of curiosity and wonder. And that, to me, I think is how I can open my mind and exercise it.
I just found it really incredible recently seeing this dementia patient. She had really deteriorated in her, progression of the disease. And one thing that really kind of grounded her and brought her back, she was a ballerina. You've probably maybe seen this on social media, but Swan Lake is not an easy piece. I didn't perform it, but I was a dancer growing up. And she knew every hand movement, every look. And it was just, it was really kind of so comforting because that was something that she really must have enjoyed growing up. And I really think that those, memories were so ingrained in her mind that even though she might not remember what day it is or one of her relatives, she remembered that. And it was that sensory music and, just feeling. And I thought that was super, super encouraging. And I know personally, the woman that I grew up dancing with, she's 69 years old. She was my dance teacher and she still teaches. And that is just incredible to me because she has just as much energy as she did when she was 40 something teaching me. And it's really amazing to see that passion and that mind memory is just always there.
I was thinking of the idea of exorcising the mind.
Oh God, okay.
As a way of kind of opening up the resources, flushing out the unnecessary demonic natterings of the mind so that more of it is available. But I was also thinking from a photographic standpoint about the aperture of a camera lens. If you want a sharp focus, you squeeze that aperture down really, really tight, and there's very little that'll get through there. But it's very linear when it's squeezed down tight. So the light comes through at one very straight angle, and it has a very sharp focus, but there's very little light that actually gets through. So if you open the aperture, you get a much softer focus, but a lot more light comes in. I think this is where the element of time that he was referring to is when you're taking, let's say, night photography, you open the aperture way up and then you wait for that light to collect and to embed itself either in your digital format or however it is that you're collecting that light. But it requires a softening of the focus. And I'm also reminded of my first Aikido teacher talking about that if you clench down, you lose power. It's only through the relaxing and the softening that the actual power can travel through this system. And so I think when we tighten down too hard, maybe concentrate too hard on something, we lose all those things that Daniel referred to as the things that we're not seeing. So I think softening up and maybe sometimes not trying so hard.
Thank you. So when Daniel was talking, I was thinking about a recipe. When we're going to cook, we have to think about, okay, what we're seeing on the recipe card. Then we have to pull it all together. Then we have to actually cook it. And so that's a real exercise. And thinking about the kids that are in my house and they want to learn, I thought that was the perfect way to exercise their brains. And I just was so impressed with Daniel's enthusiasm. I think I know that myself, as the older I get, the less enthusiastic I am to do all the stuff I have to do. But seeing anybody else that's enthusiastic certainly is infectious. Amen.
Mary, you're one of the most enthusiastic people I think I know. So I can't imagine what you were like as a teenager if you're this enthusiastic now. Carol Ann or Robin, do you have any thoughts?
Well, for one thing, let me make the observation that given the nature of the members of this group, a starting point in astronomy sure leads to some very productive and interesting insights into the ways of expanding thinking. So I'd like to express my amazement. Thank you for letting me join this group. It's quite an amazing group that can bring out so many interesting things from something that's far afield in subject. I would like to add, since I have this opportunity to try to contribute something, I'd like to add that in the Zen tradition, of which I'm somewhat familiar, there is a distinction between thinking, non-thinking, or thinking. Let me start all over again. Thinking, not thinking, and non-thinking. So let me see if I can explain the gist of this in relation to what we're talking about. When we're expanding the mind, exercising the mind, we can certainly concentrate and improve our reasoning skills and our cognitive skills and improve our knowledge base and such. But if we can categorize that kind of exercise as the exercise of thinking, we can look to what exercising not thinking might be. Not thinking is the abeyance, the negation of thinking, in which we do things, well, in a more or less automatic way, perhaps jumping to conclusions and taking shortcuts and such, and maybe not using the skills of cognition and reasoning and things that we learn in school, building our knowledge base and our logical thinking and such. And that certainly is another way of exercising our mind, I believe, our consciousness. But let's take a look at non-thinking. In the Zen tradition, non-thinking refers to an entirely different category of consciousness or awareness, in which sensation and data is being input, but without forming it into information packets and labeling and putting them into categories and putting judgments on them and such. So that in any kind of meditation, for example, one would accept what is there in experience without following or without chasing away or without labeling or without putting one's own cognitive or personal spin on the information. And that kind of awareness, let's call non-thinking, and exercising that kind of thinking might well come from sheer, well, what I think of as deep listening. Many of the speakers today had trees in the background, and trees are non-cognitive, but certainly are expressive, and certainly are demonstrating some kind of connectivity and life that is well worth listening to, and listening to this kind of demonstration that is not a demonstration of thinking or not a demonstration of the negation of thinking, but a demonstration of something that is very very clear and not negative, very accepting, that is leading to I know not what, but it's part of this bigger kind of way things work. This kind of exercise of non-thinking can be performed, I think, in listening to trees. So let me conclude with that possible way of exercising the mind, listening to trees.
Thank you very much, Robin. It's been a reoccurring theme at Gems from the wisdom traditions about the idea of deep listening, and I think all the contributions I've heard so far are about the mind has many abilities. We shouldn't just think of it as, using the normal way we think in academic ways or logical ways. In fact, I think I just read a quote by Einstein. He said that logic will get us from A to B, but our imagination will take us everywhere. But what is the imagination? I think you guys are all touching on the mystery of the imagination and how it's this amazing part of what we might call the storehouse of the mind or the wheelhouse of the mind. But what we can do if we open up our minds to all of its different potentials by not knowing, by just trying to divest ourselves of a sense of this is the way things are and trying to see things anew and afresh, and listening to trees, as you're suggesting, Robin, is a way to have deeper insights into who we are and the world we live in. I heard one quote somewhere that the idea of studying nature and knowing thyself in the end are the same thing. They kind of loop back on each other. So studying the universe, but then also going inside of ourselves and trying to understand our inner workings, they're interrelated. One person that's done a couple of presentations here, Kirk Godines, sent a talk from a Zen Roshi, and his whole thing was just sitting and not thinking. And also his phrase he said about himself is, "I'm good for nothing." That instead of being a specialist on this, that, or the other thing, by being good for nothing, you're open for learning from all these different realms, like Carolyn was suggesting in her presentation or her thoughts. But anyone else have any thoughts on exercise? Oh, there you are, Robert.
Cliff, we're going to show a Shakespearean play here in a few minutes in Concord Hall. Much Ado About Nothing.
Shakespeare was onto that idea.
You're quite right, because nothing is a big theme in Shakespeare. And all kinds of things come from nothing, both metaphysically and psychologically and physically. Anybody that knows King Lear, the play starts out with him saying nothing can come from nothing when his daughter Cordelia says nothing. And the whole tragedy comes from that.
That's interesting.
So in this play, Much Ado About Nothing, there's all kinds of nothings in it. There's like lies and deception. Well, lies and deception in some sense are nothing, but they can lead to something, either good or bad, as they do in the play. And it's well known for its witty banter between Beatrice and Benedict. But what does that amount to in the end? Really nothing. So I just thought it was an interesting link that you start talking about nothing. Where that Roshi, he sets for nothing.
Right, yeah.
But in a Shakespearean sense, look out if you set for nothing.
I think the idea is to be able to see things afresh, to see things anew. And we tend to wake up every morning with a kind of already set to see things in the same way we saw things yesterday and the day before and so forth. But how to begin each day kind of like Thoreau is saying in the quote that you gave at the beginning, Diana, in this very fresh and childlike manner, so that the world we're living in, which is completely a world of mystery, isn't taken for granted. We don't see things the same way. I mean, even in Hawaii, we see rainbows all the time, and we go, oh gosh, there's another rainbow. But everything around us is mystery and miracle, and how to get that back into our way of seeing the world and living in the world and using our minds, I think is a big part of this idea of exercising the mind, instead of just getting passive and routinized in how we go about our days.
Well,
I see you nodding there.
Yeah, I'm nodding because for me, that's beginner's heart mind. That is the not knowing and coming from a wonder and gratitude with everything that we have in our life, and it's like, I think what happens with thinking sometimes people, and what's happening in our world, is people get so stuck in their thinking and their own ego mind ruminations that there's no room for love or listening or being with other people. And so when we get on these tracks, that we lose that sense of gratitude and wonder and love. And I think that's the trouble. We get caught in our minds and we don't really see the rest of the world. So that's why I was nodding. I agree with you 100%.
Maybe Carol, let me just throw this question out real quick. How can we help children exercise the mind? Because as especially teenagers now, and you hear about social media and all these other things, but there's a lot of, I think, young people that are going through mental challenges these days, perhaps more than sometime in the past. And this idea of exercising the mind or using the mind in a positive and creative way, what can we do with the children that are coming within our orbit to help them better use their minds in a healthy way?
There is so much profound research. I think children have so much independent curiosity naturally that it's really about fostering an environment for them to feel safe in exploring whatever it is their little heart desires to put attention to. I think that when we stop focusing on the formidable education where it's you go to school and you learn everything by write and rote and by repetition, and realize that technology has brought us to a place where the youth can focus on a love interest and find a passion that isn't being built on a foundation that's K through 12. That there are so many great models with immersion culture education in Hawaii that fosters intelligence through heritage and through ohana. And I think a lot about the school and education that Malia sends her kids to. And she speaks a lot about the immersion culture, giving children a safe place and a sense of love and culture and belonging is independently the most profound gift that we could give the upcoming generations.
So a quick insertion. I mean, we've shared a lot of ways in which you can get going on thinking or wondering and all that. But then there's a second level where you discover heroes or individuals or teachers or whatever, and they inspire you. And that inspiration can last a whole lifetime. Think how many go back to Emerson, or it could be your sixth grade teacher. It could be, and that's very important in developing the mind, that you discover and you respect and you continue to, you question, but you get very connected to somebody who has inspired you to learn and inspire you to question. So I think we want to put that, and children respond to that. We read the fairy tales and all the rest of the biographies. And it seems very important that they develop at least a few heroes that they can kind of go to in their consciousness when they need to or is relevant. So I just wanted to put that on the list.
Well, I want to thank you guys all. It's good to see all your shiny faces and all your contributions today, and look forward to next week. And have a good rest of your weekend. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.
Stay well.
Thank you.
Bye.